So, welcome to another Smart Digital Workshop where we stay motivated and rise together by engaging in real conversations that enhance your personal and professional brand. My name is Dr. Theo Fowles, and I'm joined by my co-facilitator, Dr. Jackie Thomas.
Our guest today is Dr. Lissa Ramirez-Stapleton. She's originally from Columbus, Ohio, and she's an assistant professor at Cal State University Northridge in the Deaf Studies Department. She's also a core faculty in the Educational Leadership and Policy Studies program. She loves working within and with deaf communities and helping to bridge the gap of understanding between deaf and hearing communities. Dr. Ramirez-Stapleton earned her BA from Wright State University in social work, her master's from the University of Dayton in college student personnel, and her PhD from Iowa State University in higher education. She has been married for 2 years to Dr. Marcella Ramirez-Stapleton, and I am going to go ahead and get started with the first question. Dr. Ramirez-Stapleton, please describe your pathway to the role that you currently have and describe the catalyst moment that led you to begin your path towards a professorship.
That's a good question. I actually started, I actually have to go back to high school. So I was involved in like a drug prevention, say no to drugs, leadership program in high school. And they always had these weekend leadership retreats. And so one year they were really intentional about inviting inner city kids and suburb kids, but specifically this year they invited the deaf residential school to come to this weekend retreat. And so really it was my first time and first exposure to deaf peers and working with interpreters and even understanding that there was a different world out there that I had not considered, a different culture, a different kind of community of folks I had not considered. And really that experience changed the trajectory of my life moving forward. Because really after that, I decided I really wanted to take American Sign Language in college. And so got to Wright State, took several years of sign language there, social work major, as you said. So I thought I might have deaf clients or again, just kind of working in the community, thought that sign language would be helpful. And so with my foreign language, from there, got my master's. And when I went on my nationwide kind of search for student affairs, I started looking at various different schools. My background's housing. And so California State University has the third largest deaf student population at a four-year institution in the country. And then I also interviewed at Rochester Institute of Technology, which has the second largest deaf student population. And I didn't actually realize that at the time, but found that out the process of interviewing, accepted a job at CSUN and worked with deaf students in the living learning communities and really started to get a better understanding of what was happening specifically with deaf students of color and why we weren't able to retain them in college and what was happening around issues of counseling, culture, language development. And so all of these kind of experiences led me back to get a PhD because we couldn't figure out how to do better. And we needed research, we needed some evidence and data to help us figure out how do we impact practice differently. And so that's what led me back to the PhD, which I always thought I'd come back to administration and be like a dean of students or something. And that was not in the cards. My research specifically right now focuses on Black deaf college students. And that experience of, I think, engaging with the community and understanding the greater need led me back to, what if you were a professor? Like, what if you went back and you taught and you published this work and you tried to get it out to the community, you tried to impact change differently than just in higher education? And so here I am. I never thought I'd be a professor, like ever, but it was in the cards. Yeah. That's good.
Okay. Well, you mentioned your research just now. I want to go back a little bit more. Can you tell us what your doctoral research was on and what you found?
Yes. So I actually have to go a little bit further back because I think it's important as a hearing person to unpack why I work within deaf communities, specifically deaf communities of color. And I felt like throughout my whole process from having the job at CSUN in housing to coming to Iowa State, I never thought I had a really solid answer to that question. It was always like, well, I want to support the community, or I want to be involved, or it just never felt like it had any substance to it. And so I spent a summer in Ghana working at a deaf residential school. And the whole point was to go to Ghana to do some self-work, me work, but also to dig deeper in why am I doing this work specifically within deaf spaces? And so I spent 2.5 months there, living in the mountains, up in the forest of forests, the deep trees. And I got a chance to work with a whole lot of amazing Black kids. And I got a lot of time to reflect on the fact that my liberation as a Black queer woman is directly intertwined with a variety of deaf people's liberation. Like, our liberations are intertwined. And so my work is about liberation for all of us. And this is just one avenue to navigate and to find liberation, but that ultimately liberation is the goal. And the ending of various oppressions is the goal. And so as a person who has privilege in this space, it gives me an opportunity to really work with my own people, which is my own hearing people, to do better and get better. And so that directly connects to my work, because there's a lot of deficit research on Black deaf people, but just deaf students, period. And so my dissertation focused on in what ways were Black deaf students successfully graduating from college, and how could we better understand that journey to be able to then teach those skills to younger kids versus all the ways in which they were not being successful. Because people are graduating and people are kind of beating these odds and these numbers, but we don't have a good sense of what it takes, or what it has been. What are the resources? What has been the support? What does resiliency look like? What does cultural capital look like within deaf communities, and specifically within Black deaf communities? So my work was really, this group is so my dissertation is called The Unexpected Talented 10th. And so this whole idea that you are also a part of this talented 10th, and how do we learn the skills that you've been able to gain to be able to teach younger kids? And so now that's transitioned into kind of really doing all Black deaf work, so historical work and persistence work, but really, again, focused on deaf communities of color.
And speaking of communities, could you describe the history of the deaf student community at CSUN, and kind of describe what its culture is today?
Yeah, so a couple things I think I have to explain, kind of big picture about deaf education to better understand CSUN. So we are what's called a mainstream school. And so mainstream essentially is that there is the majority of the folks that in that space or that school are hearing, and there's either a deaf program, a separate deaf classroom, separate deaf resources, or just an intentional support of deaf people in that educational setting. So we are different than what folks would consider when they think about deaf education in terms of Gallaudet. We are not Gallaudet. So Gallaudet in Washington, D.C. primarily serves deaf students. They only let a certain percentage of hearing students in each year. And so their foundation, their purpose of existing as an institution is specifically for deaf students, where we are started off and still are a very hearing-centric school that has a lot of deaf resources and support. So we have about 150 deaf students, pretty racially diverse, gender diverse, but we have about 40,000 hearing students. So that would be the difference of the two. We also have, I think, again, in terms of being intentional, in terms of being a mainstream school, most universities, deaf students would go to a disability services office to get interpreting services or note takers, where at CSUN, we have a disability services office, and then we have another resource is called the National Center on Deafness. And this particular group takes care of all deaf student needs. So advising, admissions, getting interpreters for classes, all of our deaf-centered student organizations, our culturally deaf sorority, all comes out of that center. And so our deaf students actually don't ever go to our disability services office unless they have another kind of need around a learning disability or something else that they need support in. But if they're coming to school and they identify as deaf and they need those resources, and they would go to the National Center on Deafness.
Awesome. And is that National Center the reason that there are a number of deaf students at CSUN? I'm kind of trying to figure out the impetus, because a lot of schools could put resources towards making sure that deaf students have a community, but it seems like CSUN, as you said, with the numbers, has more than most schools. So I'm trying to figure out, what started that interest or how that came about.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. I mean, I think people could put resources. So there's that center that has a long history, and really the center started off as a space to educate the community. So it doesn't just support deaf students on campus, but it also provides interpreter professional development training. And so it's also a community outreach center in some ways as well. But we also have a deaf studies department, which there is not a lot of deaf studies departments at four-year institutions. So that also, we're one of the oldest programs and one of the largest programs in the country. And so between having the center and then also having the degree there, I think we become an attractive space and place. We're also the largest on the West Coast. So the other two larger institutions with deaf students on the East Coast, we're also public. The other two schools are private. One is a technical school, one is more of a liberal arts school. So I think it really depends on what students are interested in. So if you don't want to go that far from home, or you're interested in something that's not within the liberal arts curriculum or not within a technology-based curriculum, then CSUN would be, I think, a more attractive space. If you went to mainstream school growing up in high school, you may not be interested in a complete immersion of an entire deaf space. This might actually feel more aligned with the education you've had up to that point. And also a lot of our students don't want to go that far from home. You know, I think that students, particularly when you start thinking about the kind of intersecting identities and various identities that people have, you know, family being pretty central for quite a few of our students, going all the way to the East Coast is way too far. And so I think we provide a closer option that also supports their education and helps them to be successful without having to go to the other side of the country.
That makes sense. So I know that in your research, you mentioned moving away from the deficit thinking and working more towards a strengths-based form of thought. So when you think about the deaf student community on your campus, what would you say are their biggest strengths, and how have you leveraged those strengths to help those students become even more successful?
Yes. Oh, there's so many strengths. There's so many strengths. I think the one to pull out is resiliency. Folks are incredibly patient, and in moments when they don't have to be. And I think creative, particularly around communication. And so I think the resiliency piece is that most deaf people are born into hearing families. About 90% of deaf individuals are born into hearing families. So you are already being born into a family that may not culturally understand you all the time, and linguistic wise may or may not learn sign language, right? So you're kind of always navigating communication. And so I think there's a lot of just trying to navigate family, but also navigate the educational system, which still is not providing adequate education for our deaf kids, particularly deaf kids of color. And so there's just constant kind of like navigating, figuring out the political landscape, getting your needs met, navigating language. So I think there's a lot of resiliency of kind of falling down, standing back up. Okay, that didn't work. Okay, let me try this. If that didn't work, let me try this. Around communication, I think oftentimes hearing people how we have the privilege of waking up and never questioning, am I going to be able to order my latte this morning? Am I going to be able to communicate with this person at the store? If there's an emergency, am I going to be able to communicate my needs? If the police come, am I going to be able to communicate in a way that they don't think that I look hostile or that I am being physically aggressive because you think my signing is physically aggressive, right? These are all these things that we don't have to think about, that deaf individuals have to think about all the time in terms of how am I going to communicate with this hearing person who may or may not be receptive to me, may or may not be willing to write back and forth, may or may not be willing to text back and forth, is going to insist that I talk when that may or may not be something that I can or cannot do. So I think the creativity and willingness to meet people where they're at and try to navigate communication is a huge strength that our deaf students come to the table with. I'm missing one: creativity, language, resiliency, patience. Autism is awful. Autism is something that I think that most people aren't conscious of, particularly hearing people, but the discrimination against deaf people in these both big and small ways. So I think sometimes people think, oh, well, if there's not captions on a video, then that's a form of autism. Yes, because you're limiting access to information, but that's a very kind of obvious, like you need to have captions or you need to have interpreters. And those are the first things that people think about. And things that people don't think about is attitude, your willingness to navigate and negotiate spaces. I've had events where people didn't think it was aesthetically pleasing to have the interpreter on the stage of an event. They wanted them down below. Well, if the person is presenting up top and the interpreter's down here, I can't keep going back and forth, visually wise, right? Even communications within meetings, when you have a deaf or hard of hearing person in a meeting and people are trying to contribute, and hearing people talk over each other all the time. It is culturally what we do. There's not a lot of turn taking, but if you have an interpreter, there's a lag in communication. And so you have to give time for the interpreter to take it in, translate it, interpret it out for the deaf person to get it, and then think and then respond. And that whole process, hearing people aren't always conscious that it takes more time to do that. And so I think these are all these different ways that autism shows up that deaf people are navigating. That again, as a hearing person and hearing privilege, that we don't think about. And so the resiliency to navigate those spaces, to be patient with people, to continuously educate hearing people about what they should or should not do, are strengths that our deaf students have and that deaf community members have, big picture, which we just have to do better as hearing people, generally speaking.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So we're going into a brand new decade.
Yes.
What are things you are working on right now that you are excited about?
Oh, I'm excited about. Okay, so I am currently working on a historical project that is connecting HBCUs and Black deaf education. So I am just swimming around in 1930s data, archival data. So I've been to Hampton University, Southern University A&M, a little bit with West Virginia State University. Those are my main ones at this point, but I'm interested. Let me back up. So I'm really interested in why we don't have enough Black interpreters and Black deaf educators and hearing Black educators within deaf education. And so this is the constant issue. There's just not enough. There's not enough. There's not enough. And so I look at my own program, I'm just like, where are all the Black people? There's not enough, there's not enough. And so I felt like I needed to go back in time to better understand how we got to where we are right now. And we know that our HBCUs graduate a large number of Black people, right? And we know that they graduate some of the largest number of teachers in the country, Black teachers in the country. But at this current moment, none of our HBCUs have deaf education or deaf studies programs. But that has not been the past. So when segregation of schools, white deaf schools and Black deaf schools were also segregated. So in order for Black deaf schools to be established, then they recruited teachers, they recruited administrators from HBCUs, right? There are several Black deaf schools that were built next to or on the same property as HBCUs. So really our Black deaf kids have had access to college, particularly in Louisiana. Southern University A&M built the Black college and built the Black deaf school and the Black blind school on their campus. So the president of the university was also their superintendent at the same time. So there's all these like nuances of like, actually our Black deaf kids have been on college campuses for a really long time, right? That whole model is not new. And so again, kind of going back in time and seeing, we used to have these relationships with HBCUs and Black deaf education. We don't now. What happened between the then and the now? What did we do well and what did we not do well? So again, when we talked about like my interest is really between Black hearing and deaf hearing relationships and understanding. And so there are moments where we've been in solidarity with each other as Black people. So again, supporting these Black deaf schools and making sure they're up and running. But we've also had issues of hearing privilege for Black hearing individuals. So for example, Black hearing people being really the people in control of these schools and then providing a very hearing-centric education for deaf kids, not understanding that really deaf people need to be responsible for their own curriculum and educating their own kids, and that hearing Black people also are not the expert, just like white hearing people are not the experts of our kids, right? And so we've perpetuated some of that because we thought it was a better education. So I'm speaking specifically now about oral education, so teaching kids how to vocalize, how to lip read versus teaching them how to sign. We did a lot of that in the past with the relationships with HBCUs and Black deaf schools, and that is a problem. So I'm interested in those issues, but also the ways in which we did things really well, so that we can learn from that and that we can potentially figure out, well, what does that mean for us now moving forward? How do we reimagine deaf education for Black kids now and for all kids of color and all deaf kids now based off of what we might learn from this relationship of the past? And so with that project, I'm working on a book, which I'm pretty excited about. But I also that's very kind of academic-y, and it's also, books are very, written books can be very hearing centric, right? So I'm trying to figure out how to take the information and turn it into signed videos. So there's a signed portion of my book. And then also, how do I take all the Black Deaf history that I'm learning? So I'm putting together a Black Deaf education timeline and weaving in Deaf history and Black Deaf history all within this timeline, so you can see how different pieces of influence to other parts of each other, and figuring out, how do I teach that to kids? How do I give kids back their history, give kids back their foundation? And so I'm working with a Black Deaf artist, Sean Robertson, who we've been working together for the past 8 months to turn all of these historical events and curriculum into cartoons. And so we will then have a video that I'll work with our residential school, deaf residential school here, where high school kids will actually be talking about the history with the images that he drew that represent these different parts of history. And so, again, just excited to, I think, dig into historical stuff, but also find ways to give back to the community that's accessible. People should have access to their own stuff, and stuff shouldn't get stuck in the ivory tower, ever. So, but that's what I'm excited about for 2020. Lots of work.
Well, good luck.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask you more about your journey.
Yes.
So what would you say is the typical route to your field in your position?
Oh, so I do not think there's a typical route. Let me think. I actually get this question a lot from students, because they're like, well, how did you get to be a deaf studies professor? And there isn't, so deaf studies, generally speaking, is pretty interdisciplinary. So I'm from higher ed, my colleagues are from linguistics, someone else is from history. Like, we have all these different backgrounds. But what I will say is that when I reflect back to how I got here, I said yes to various opportunities that, if I had said no at any point, because it seemed unorthodox, or it seemed inconvenient, or it wasn't on the exact path that everyone was telling me I should have gone, I would have missed the opportunity to get to where I am now. So, for example, going to Ghana in the summer, I was in the middle of writing my dissertation. There's nothing smart about taking the whole summer to go find yourself. There's nothing smart about this. Generally speaking, right? You should be focused. You should be using the summers to really like grind and get done. And I was like, I gotta pause. I need to pause and make sure this is the right path, and that this feels right, and that this is in line with where I think I should be doing, right? So had I not said yes to that, I might have picked a very different route in terms of my research that would have impacted my ability to get to where I am now, right? So I think you have to say yes to things that feel really great, and sometimes you have to say no to things that are just good. And I think there's an in-between of trying to figure out what that means for you. But there's a lot of good things around, but you got to figure out what the good things are versus the great things. And so for me, it's been taking a moment to engage with mentors and do some journaling and really figure out what I'm passionate about for that moment, because passion changes, and kind of moving with intention, and not moving out of fear that if I don't do this, then I can't get a job, or if I don't do this, which I think I did in undergrad a lot. In undergrad, it was all about, I need a job when I get done. And I think had I known then that I was going to take this journey, I might have majored in something very different as an undergrad, and looked at something I was just really interested in versus like, I have to get a job. Now, don't get me wrong. Getting a job is important. And, taking different paths to get that job, I think you have to be open. Work is not going anywhere. So rushing to try to get through school to get a job, work is not going anywhere. So go to the Peace Corps, try that new experience, or pick up that minor, or take an extra time to build relationships with people, do some community work, get some life experience, because school and work aren't going anywhere. You can always come back to these things. But those types of experiences, once you've missed them, you can't always come back to them, right? And so I think that is some of the things I've learned in my journey. And in terms of how I got here, like I said, I think it's been saying yes to different opportunities, working some, being in relationship people, really listening to folks of like, what is the real need? So for example, all the research I do now, I don't present that work at academic conferences first. I take it to community-based conferences and say, okay, what do you think about this? Is this anywhere near what you think you might need? Or am I in line? Is it off? Is it rooted in real community interest? Because if not, and let me start over again, or let me tweak it. And then based off of what the community says, then I may keep going, and then it gets to the academic conference, then it gets to a journal, right? But it always starts in community. And so I think being rooted is really important, and continuing to stay rooted and keeps you grounded when the academy does not.
So along those same lines, there's no typical route, but what would you say are some challenges that Black women face when they advance in the professoriate?
Advancing. I think you can't lose yourself in the midst of the process. So for example, my experience thus far in my current position is that if Black women are quick to say yes, particularly if it's something for the community, if it's something for a student, if it's something particularly for a student that you might be able to relate to culturally, identity, something like that. And so I am having to balance what I feel is cultural responsibilities with my own mental health and my own boundaries. And I have to set them. I can love you and I have to set boundaries because I have to love me too. And so I think that balance is really challenging. I think loneliness is real in the academy, and finding other people that culturally identify and connect with you can be really challenging depending upon where you are at. And having to try to create, I feel like for me in my situation, I've always had to create the space to get the nourishment that I need to keep going, which is also exhausting, right? So right now I'm working with our Black Faculty and Staff Association, which I'm really excited about and really know that I need as a faculty member, but it hasn't been established for a really long time. So I am both knee deep in trying to like get it up and running, because I know that I need it to survive working here, right? So there's this constant balance of creating your own support systems, creating your own support networks that is exhausting. And again, you have to go back to kind of mental health and, spreading the work out and figuring out when you need to say, no, I can't work all weekend. That's not going to be reasonable. Or, I need to take a break. I need to go on vacation. I need to disconnect. And again, I think it goes back to figuring out what's important, what the priorities are, and taking care of self. But I think identifying and knowing that sometimes the academy is really lonely is real. And how you navigate through those moments and how you build community relationships, I think it's really important.
I think it's really telling that we create the organizations that support ourselves, right? When you're one of a few or one of one, maybe, like just finding that network is always tough. So the next question that I have kind of relates to that, right? We talked about in your research and how you present, you go to community-based organizations first. And so thinking about how you develop yourself and how you develop these organizations, are there any organizations that you would suggest to be a part of in this field, specifically as it relates to the deaf community, or in the larger field of academia as well? Are there organizations that are your go-tos?
Yes. So interesting enough, with deaf conferences, they don't happen every year. So you have to catch them on cycle. So I always go to the National Black Deaf Advocates Conference, and that's every 2 years. And then they have some local kind of conferences. I try to get to the Deaf People of Color Conference, which happens 3 to 4 years. I get to the Council de Manos, which is the Deaf Latinx Conference, which happens, I think, every 3 years also in rotation. So really any type of community-based deaf conference, I'm typically trying to get to. And again, it's often just to observe, to volunteer, to learn, sometimes to share the research, to see if it lands on folks. to be in community, to build relationships. And again, I think to have a partnership between the community and the academic stuff is really important. So the academic conferences I tend to go to is the to ASH, the Association of Study of Higher Education. I've been really actively involved with the ACPA in the past when I was doing more kind of administrative staff work. And so now that I've kind of transitioned to full faculty, you got to pick and choose, So I'm going to NCORE this year, so I'm looking forward to that. We have a special issue coming out on disability justice, race, and education, which will be NCORE's Journal J Score's first special issue. So we're excited about that, and we'll go to NCORE this year. So I generally enjoy NCORE. I think of other conferences I find myself at. AHEAD is good. So it's the Association of Higher Education of Disability. AHA, so Association of Higher Education and Disability. Their conferences are in the summer, and so they're really based, I guess the audience is folks who work in disability services offices, but it's also open to a variety of staff, faculty, but it's disability specific for higher education. I find that conference to be probably the most accessible conference that is out there. So I feel like organizations that are trying to figure out, well, how do I make webinars accessible, or how do I make, my conference sessions or things economically accessible, like that conference does such an amazing job at doing that. So I think there's just a lot to learn just by physically being there and seeing how things work and operate on top of, I think, the knowledge that is shared during that time. So those are a couple that
That's great.
Yeah.
So I feel like you touched on this a little bit in how you take care of yourself and mental health and all of that. But specifically, the question is, what advice would you give yourself if you're entering this field today?
Ooh, if I was entering it today, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be perfect. You don't always have to get it right. It's actually not possible to always get it right. It's just not possible. So you might as well take a deep breath, laugh at yourself a little more. Definitely laugh a lot, actually a lot more. Laugh at yourself a lot more. Take more time to build the relationships. Like, yes, you always have 10 minutes. You always have 10 minutes just to check in. You really do. Like you have a moment to really check in with people and to hear the response that, to the question that you've asked in terms of how is somebody really doing. I think I would tell myself, I think it's important to enjoy the ride to try new things, to not be afraid again to fail, because you might learn a whole lot in the midst of that process. And self-care is important. Nobody should be in the office all hours of the night. You just shouldn't be. It doesn't matter what job you have. And as someone that came from housing, I get it. The duty rotation and that 24-hour job life is real, but nobody should be working all the time. Nobody. You don't owe any job your whole life and all of your health and all your mental health. You just don't. You don't owe the academy that. The academy, I think the best advice I've been given is the academy will not love you. The academy will work you. Will work you to death, and then we'll find someone else to replace you once you're burnt out. And so you can't give it everything because it's a machine. It's just a machine. And so you have to, if you're going to work in the system, which I think higher education is very much a part of the larger system of kind of oppression that we talk about, which is a whole nother, I'm sure, time together. But if you're going to work in the system to try to make change, you can't not forget that you're in the system. And that the system is built for a certain purpose, and that is not to protect you, to save you, or to take care of you per se. And so you have to do those things, and you have to rely on either chosen family, extended family, whoever, friendships to help you balance those things out. But you can't give it everything. So again, figuring out what that line looks like for you. What does that self-care look like? Whether it be leaving work on time, working out, eating well, sleeping, doTERRA oils. I'm all about some oils in my diffuser in the office. I'd be diffusing balance in my office, just trying to make the space right. You have to do what you need to do to make sure that you're taken care of, because nobody's going to look out for that. So I think those are things when I think about self-care in the academy, kind of generally speaking. speaking, which I think I also have to tell myself on a regular basis, because I think that's the other part about working in the system. You quickly start to feel like, wait a minute, maybe I should be working more, or maybe I'm not working hard enough, or maybe I could have done that better. You start to get warped, right? And you start to drink the Kool-Aid, literally, and you forget that, wait a minute, no. I'm in the system. I'm not of the system. I'm in the system trying to disrupt the system. Therefore, I can't start thinking like the system. And so sometimes you need to step out of that, get some perspective, come back in and keep working. But self-care and balance is what helps, I think, with those things.
Hope everybody is listening to what's happening right now. You are in the system, not of the system. Y'all better take notes. I want to give you the opportunity to share any final thoughts with us, any parting words of encouragement, or things that came to your mind as we were speaking today. Again, it'll help us to stay motivated and rise together.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for even inviting me. This has been fun. Last thoughts. I really believe in lifting as you climb. I generally kind of, that resonates with my spirit, but I think I've also been doing a lot of reflecting that it takes a lot of work to lift, but it takes a lot of work to also climb, to help people climb. And sometimes you can't do both at the same time. And that you have seasons. And sometimes you're in the season of climbing, and sometimes you're in the season of lifting, and both of those seasons are okay. But I think it's important to be able to communicate what season you're in, so that when you're mentoring people, when you are trying to go for that next opportunity, or you have that young person who is trying to do X, Y, and Z like you, or you have other colleagues who are holding on for dear life, right? Trying to also get up that ladder, that you have to be conscious about where you are in that process of lifting and climbing. And again, to be able to communicate that with people, and to be able to, we have to support each other and know that I can't pull on someone any more than what they can lift, right? So if I'm pulling on you, it makes it much harder for you to lift the next step. So sometimes I have to wait for you to then climb, and then you put the arm back, and then you lift me, right? So that there's seasons in this thing. And so it's something I've just been thinking, I think, a lot more about in terms of like my own energy. Like, why am I always exhausted? It's just like, because you're trying to lift and climb at the same time. And these things may not actually be fully possible to do. And so think through that a little bit. And what I tell my mentees, like, listen, I can do this, and this, but I can't do this part, right? Because I can't, I don't have the capacity to do this part, but I can read that feedback, and I can support you in that letter in this moment. But I really need to get my tenure packet in, because if I don't get my tenure packet in, I'm not gonna be here. So I gotta lift, I gotta climb, and I'm gonna come back and get you, but I gotta keep my job at the same time, right? And so I think this idea of lifting as you climb is something we have to unpack as Black people. We have to remember the root of it, particularly rooted in Black women. But we need to I think, just dive deeper into that, because in the midst of this really powerful statement motto, we're also killing ourselves, right? And so what does it look like to support each other? What does it look like to unpack some of our traditions and ways of being that have maybe helped us in a certain time, but we have to rethink them and repackage them now for them to be useful. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking about now. Yes.
This has been another episode in the Smart Digital Workshop series. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Ramirez-Stapleton, for all of your words and all of the gems that you dropped today. This episode will be edited and shared across multiple platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and SoundCloud. And as the participant today, you will be the first to know of its availability.
Great. And one more thing, this episode in particular, we're going to make sure that there's transcripts available for everyone as well. So be sure to share those too.
Yes.
And that's a wrap. Thanks so much.
Thank you.